Tēnā koutou katoa. Nau mai, haere mai, piki mai, whakatau mai. E mihi ana ki te atua ko ia te timatanga me te mutunga o ngā mea katoa. Ngā mihi mai oha ki a koutou katoa, rau rangatira mā. Tēnā koe e ngā rangatira Professor Tracy McIntosh. He mihi nui ki a koe. A vea ia lo leo e whai masoi o te whaatalofa atu ai pa ia malmalu o tātou au whia. Talofa lava, warm Pacifica greetings. A vea o te whaftaile ang lelei le atua o te whaatalofa atu ai lau a whionga, Professor McIntosh, mō le nei avanua tāu e tuina mai, tātou te mafuta ai. For me, it is an absolute privilege to be here today and to be the chair of a very good friend and colleague, Professor Tracy McIntosh. The time that I have had in terms of spending and sitting with Tracy in various boards and various advisory groups has been an absolute privilege. And I know that her kōrero today will continue to enlighten us as well as challenge us, as well as be able to invoke some thoughts in the work that we do and who we engage with out in the communities. So I welcome you, Tracy, and I welcome all of you that are here sharing in this kōrero, listening to this kōrero, and being part of our program for today. Now, as with anything, there are always going to be a few administrative things that I've got to go through before I hand it over to Tracy. So just a few things, just to remind us all again, we have our community code. This is just our way of being with each other as we head into our workshop for today. So just to be mindful, yes, great that we are curious, we are open, and that we are respectful, maintaining our confidentiality, one person, one mic, and making sure that as we make the space, that we also take the space. Now, the second thing that I also need to talk to and acknowledge, following on from our community code, is making sure that we are all in the right place and that we are also, so sorry, I've just got to backtrack here a bit. We've got some accessibility information here as well for you to be mindful of. So this is where the live captions are, in which you can go in and enter in the details that you are seeing on your screen right now. So now, before I hand it over to you, Tracy, I do want to say a few things, and you'll probably cringe, but that's okay, because this is important. Tracy McIntosh is Ngai Tūhoi and is Professor of Indigenous Studies in Te Wānanga o Waipapa at the University of Auckland. She's a Chief Science Advisor for the Ministry of Social Development and a Commissioner of Te Kāhui Tātautituri. She has worked with the Royal Commission on Abuse and Care, including being a facilitator on the survivor panel at the Māori hearing. She was the former co-director of Ngā Pai o Te Maramatanga, New Zealand's Māori Centre of Research Excellence. Now, Tracy sits on a range of advisory groups, boards for government and community organisations, with her recent research focused on incarceration, particularly for our Māori and our Indigenous communities, looking at issues pertaining to poverty, inequality and social justice. She recognises the significance of working with those that have lived experience and expertise of incarceration and marginalisation, and acknowledges them as experts of their own condition. She has a strong interest in the interface between research and policy. This wahine toa has worked for many years with incarcerated whānau, particularly with our wahine Māori. We've generously shared their knowledge and hope that it will be a wider collective. In whakaaro today, we'll look at the role of anti-oppressive and anti-racist practice that centres on addressing systemic violence, including state violence, that is central to the work of prison abolition. This position is embedded in her work with whānau in our prisons, as well as writing numerous articles, book chapters, presentations in this area, with one of her most recent pieces of writing of Prison as Destiny, Dissent or Dissent. Imagine a world without prisons. It is my privilege to welcome you all and introduce you now to our Professor Tracy McIntosh, our wahine toa. Kia ora.
O, tēnā koe, Julia, ngā mihi ki a koe, mauri ora ki a koutou, ngā mihi nui ki a koutou. Ko ai o, ko mā tātua te waka, ko Tamarua ki te kōrero, te tangata, ko Otunuku te whenua, ko Otunuku te papakainga, ko Otunuku te marae. Ko Ngāti Kaura, te hapu, ko Tūhoi te iwi, ko Tracy McIntosh tōku ingoa. And, you know, it's really wonderful to be here and to be amongst you. I come actually with a real sense of joy and abundance. I've just been at a conferment ceremony for Papa Tawhiri Williams and Whaia Ka Williams for honorary doctorate at Waipapa Taumata Row. And so that joy I bring into that space. And I think it's important. I think it's important when we're talking about abolition that we recognize that this should also, that all emancipatory work, all work that draws on an anti-oppressive, anti-racist agenda should also have the space and the place and the need for joyful commitment to that struggle. Our belief in abolition is first and foremost philosophical. It grew from watching, experiencing, and opposing decades of reliance on concrete and steel cages as catch-all solutions to social problems. We want a society that centers freedom and justice instead of profit and punishment. Here I draw on the powerful words of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and I think it sort of sets the stage, if you like, for what we're going to look at in our time together. I want to also to mihi to all of those who have done and continue to do work in this space. It is impossible to think of this work without acknowledging and remembering our dear friend, our rangatira, Moana Jackson, but I also recognize the many others alongside of Moana. Often when there were very few that were receptive to this kōrero, who have worked in that space of abolition. I also want to mihi to the new scholars that will change our way of thinking, those including Emi Rakati, Tila Moose, Grace Gordon, the work of Papa and the work of Just Speak, but also just the collectives around them. And mostly I want to recognize those who are incarcerated and formerly incarcerated, who give of their time so generously for us to understand that they bring their expertise to these spaces and how critically important they are if we are to create these conditions for change. So my work focuses on Māori hyper-incarceration, global Indigenous incarceration, and strategies to inform decarceration. I take it as a given that there is a recognition of the devastation that the prison plays in the lives of whānau, communities, and indeed the nation. It has resulted in an increasingly unjust society where the shadow of the prison colonizes the future. And I'm going to sort of do an upside down presentation. I'm sort of going to start with my conclusions first. I think it's sort of useful, particularly on these online spaces where in the heaviness of the watching and the listening, that sometimes we can, you know, the argument, well, maybe I'm just thinking about if I'm able to keep my argument together, but so I'm going to start a little bit with my conclusions and let's see where we'll go after that. So the work of abolition is ongoing and it's long term. It is aspirational and it is practical. It relies on the imagination, but equally on day-to-day practice. It necessitates the deep engagement in critical theory, but it also means that for many of us, it means getting our hands metaphorically and actually dirty. While the work of abolition rejects the notion that prisons are a necessary and critical component of society, it also recognizes that prison abolition does not merely speak to a world where prisons are absent. The absence of prisons would not in itself create the conditions for individual and societal freedom. For that to happen, we need to have societal structures which create the conditions that allow freedom from poverty, freedom from inequality, freedom from racism, and practices of discrimination and marginalization. Freedom from harms, including interpersonal harms. To have a just society, to have a just justice system, we must create just conditions. Abolition and practices of decarceration require the presence of collective initiatives. And so that the issue around presence, we can't just think about abolition about being absence. Much more important is what it needs to be present for the possibility of abolition to occur. For us to be able to realize prison abolition, we must think about what needs to be present. I often speak about the art of decarceration, and I'm seeing art as both practice and praxis, as both skill, drawn from experience, drawn from expertise, and drawn from activism, and creative liberation. The art of decarceration is a politic of emancipation, founded on the necessity of knowing our material condition, understanding our collective histories of dispossession or of privilege, and a profound knowledge of the devastation of racism and racist actions and structural violence. Miriami Kaba and Kelly Hayes, in their 2018 article entitled A Jailbreak of the Imagination, Seeing Prisons for What They Are and Demanding Transformation, argue that the current historical moment demands a radical reimagining of how we address various harms. We must create the world we want to inhabit. And that prison abolition is a critical pillar of this new society. This calls on us to acknowledge the harms our systems inflict and to create the kind of social and economic conditions that would allow us to make choices under conditions of our own choosing. Kaba and Hayes note that the prisons confine people, but they do not confine or eradicate. Indeed, they reproduce the conditions that facilitate harms or the mentalities that perpetrate violence. An abolitionist ethic identifies the dehumanization, violence, and racial subjugation of incarceration and punitive policing and the way it informs carceral practice. It recognizes that maintaining the dominant social order through incarceration emerged as a way to preserve the power relationships inherent, for example, in slavery, or in other places inherent in invader-settler colonization. It means addressing the legacies of racism and colonialism and the need for a radical honesty in discussing and responding to these devastating legacies. It means significant cultural change, including how we discuss social harm and responses to social harm, particularly with children. It is likely to mean a new language, a new lexicon to speak about these things. It means new forms of media engagement around social harms. When abolition is conceptualized in these terms as a transformative goal of gradual decarceration and the substitution of positive social governance in place of current penal regulation that is recognized as morally, socially, and culturally unsustainable. So it is this transformative goal that is important. A basic right critical to the practice of abolition is to know why we are where we are. Whether our current condition is due to a process of cumulative advantage or cumulative disadvantage, it's important to know why we are where we are. The right to have access to the knowledge of one's condition is critical. To know the social and material forces that place one at this time in history and to understand the ramifications of that for the broader collective. To truly know the consequences of dispossession or privilege, to be able to understand our collective condition. An abolitionist framework requires positive forms of social flourishing through habilitation and social integration and collective security that are not centered around notions of criminal enforcement, confinement, criminal surveillance, punitive policing, or punishment. It needs new forms of governance, and in our settings, it will require tiriti-based constitutional transformation. But I must be crystal clear, you cannot trivialize offending. A lot of people I work alongside have done real harm to others, devastating harm. harm where the ramifications will be felt across generations. In some cases, they have perpetrated lethal harm. As an abolitionist, I am not positing that all offending is socially constructed by powerful elites or that it is imaginary offending. Real enduring harm has occurred. The evidence is clear. Significant numbers of people who are or have been incarcerated have themselves experienced high levels of social harm, and some of them have gone on to reproduce harm. To recognize this social fact is necessary but not sufficient. It does mean that we must be willing to move beyond ideological positionings and embrace the human work that is abolition, that is decarceration. It is difficult work, it is messy work. Sometimes it could be frightening work. Sometimes it can be joyful work. As I said before, a politics of emancipation must have within it a recognition of the struggle, but also recognize the joy of the freedoms to come. It can sometimes be demoralizing to work as we encounter real ethical barriers, sometimes personal barriers. We have to be prepared for what it uncovers and what it reveals. We have to be here for the long haul. Since it has taken us generations to get here, it will need a generational shift to get us out of here. And Mokapunatanga is an expression of that intent. It is an expression of our absolute confidence and belief in the possibilities and potential of flourishing futures for those that are to come. The Māori experience of colonisation is reflected in the experience of Indigenous peoples in other settler states, who have also been systemically dispossessed and alienated by state policies and practices, where they continue to be overrepresented in every single negative social indicator, including the incredibly high rates of incarceration and our gross disproportionality within those rates. The settler states have sought both to control Indigenous lives and to dispossess them of material and cultural resources in what Cunneen and Porter have called a process of immiseration. Redress and response to harm must capture the entirety of the context in which something harmful occurs. In reflecting on physical, sexual, psychological, emotional, and whānau violence, we must ensure that we address and seek to redress state, colonial, neo-colonial, legislative, structural, political, economic, cultural, religious, institutional, and collective forms of violence. These latter forms of systemic violence often provide the context for the former. Legislative violence, for example, has both historical and contemporary elements where the impact of legislation on Indigenous peoples is marked. In many cases, legislative violence produces and reproduces economic impoverishment. The colonial state uses legislative powers to alienate land and to punish, often by incarceration and other forms of detention, those original owners that sought to defend and protect their lands and resources. Neo-colonial legislation has allowed the removal of children from their families, and too often has attempted to remove their culture and their identity. Histories of confinement are not just histories of incarceration and internment. Māori and other Indigenous people have experienced other types of confinement in colonial and neo-colonial settings. Luana Ross, a Native American scholar and writing on the experience of Native Americans, noted that from the time of European contact to the present day, these people have been imprisoned in a variety of ways. She notes, and I'm quoting her here, they were confined in forts, boarding schools, orphanages, jails and prisons, and on reservations. Historically, Native people formed free sovereign nations with distinct cultures and social and political institutions, reflecting their philosophies. Today, she argues, Native people are not free, they are colonized people seeking to decolonize themselves. Luana Ross draws on the work of Robert Blauner And Ross recognized that one of the characteristics of colonialism is the restriction of movement. So this restriction of movement of colonized peoples and this attempt to negate their culture and their family whānau settings is one of the chief characteristics. Luana Ross believes that this is evidenced by the numbers of Indigenous people who are incarcerated and their long histories of different forms of confinement, including within state care facilities as children, but also as adults. This phenomena speaks to lives of restriction and constraint. Restricted lives are characterized by restricted opportunities and the normalization of negative life outcomes. As tangata whenua, we continue to experience marginalization that shapes both lives and identity. And marginality can be expressed in a number of ways. Some are able to draw on their marginal experience as a site of resistance and use that location to challenge the status quo and to transform the marginal experience. This is usually a highly politicized identity where proponents are able to draw on significant cultural capital and an in-depth knowledge of both Māori and Western traditions. Others may acknowledge a marginal state, but seek to redefine it under their own terms to allow them to develop a dynamic, distinctive, and authentic fusion identity. For others, marginalization creates a forced identity. This is characterized by a marked and stigmatized marginalization, where deprivation due to social, economic, and political factors is entrenched and far-reaching. This last identity is particularly associated with the activities of the state and the intervention of the state into the lives of individuals and whānau. Being placed in state care, for example, and alienated from one's culture and deprived of access and knowledge of one's whakapapa can create the conditions from which alternative forms of collectivity and identity can emerge. The possibility of gang formation is increased where the opportunities and aspirations of individuals is blunted and marginalized by the state and its policies, and where oppression is expressed and lived through political, economic, cultural, and social inequality and differential power relationships. Abuse in state care amplifies and exacerbates the impact of marginalization. Since 1840, Māori, as tangata whenua, have always resisted the pressures of colonial, post-colonial, and settler state policies and have sought to demonstrate and give a fully independent voice to their own social, political, economic, and cultural viewpoints. This has been particularly evident in encountering state attempts to assimilate Māori into Pākehā policies and ways of seeing, knowing, being, and doing in the world. State-sanctioned behaviour in Aotearoa, New Zealand from the 1950s to the 1990s saw in excess of 100,000 young people, grossly disproportionately Māori, being deemed to be in need of incarceration by government departmental policies. This jailing of our children. And in the contemporary time, we hear talk again of committing investments in revenue to imprison children. The legacy of this abuse continues to blossom. The tamariki of these tamariki are also found in the statistics of the criminal justice system today. There is real violence in this system. And then just sort of thinking and reflecting on violence, just as I sort of want to look at, those different legislative forms, just even the way that we think about violence is an important as a part of abolition praxis. We recognize that violence is multifaceted and can be incremental or explosive, unseen or overt. Rod Nixon describes slow violence as a violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, and attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all. The concept of slow violence, the way that Rod Nixon uses it, can be useful at looking at global problems such as environmental degradation, climate change. But I found it very useful also in understanding the impact of the violence of poverty, of racism, of hyper-incarceration and other entrenched social issues. Slow violence is real violence. And we can see it in racist policies, but also in the systemic frustration of aspirations of both young and old alike. Entrenched social issues create the conditions for violence to occur within communities. Lateral violence or horizontal violence can be understood as violence that is directed inwardly towards peers and family rather than at external adversaries. And it is an expression of deep social and personal mamai, dissatisfaction, particularly in marginalized communities. Systemic violence is often the locus of trauma and the precedent to material deprivation that spans generation. Systemic suffering is the deliberate and planned delivery of processes, policies, practices that generate human and environmental suffering. Genocide and gross human rights abuses are extreme forms of systemic violence. Colonial violence has meant the dispossession of land in one century has created the conditions for systemic racialized injustice and violence in the next. Indigenous scholar Shannon Speed, in drawing on the experience of incarcerated Indigenous migrant workers in the US, has argued that while interpersonal violence, criminal violence, and state violence are often understood as distinct dynamics, in fact, she argues, and I'm quoting her here, these forms of violence are inseparable, each bound to the other and mutually formative in the larger context in which they affect women's lives. Violence is then a dominant characteristic of all forms of colonization. Its shape and configuration may differ, but it has been a feature of colonization since its inception. And there is a recognition around how this impacts, as I said, at the more interpersonal level as well. Violence can be a learned behavior, and it can be a strategy to resist further victimization. It can be used to attempt to control or dominate others. Violence generates more violence, both on a microstructural level, everyday individual or group interactions, and within macro structural levels. As an intentional exercise of force or power, violence perpetuates pain through either physical force, through physical assault, psychological manipulation, fear, anxiety, shame, social violence, stigma and social isolation, or political oppression from direct police or military violence to other forms of institutional violence. The last of these includes forms of structural and symbolic violence through social institutions, including the criminal justice system. Structural violence can be identified through practices that embed poverty, for example, for Indigenous people, and systemic colonization via dispossession of land and removal of the Indigenous economic base, culture, and livelihood, together with the generation of sites of confinement, such as youth hostels, hostels, native schools, systemic deprivation of basic human rights. Symbolic violence, on the other hand, appears as the result of systemic normalization and canonization to the degree where violence becomes misrecognized, taken for granted, and seen as something normal rather than as a form of violence and domination. And this is why the inability to think beyond the prison, because we have so normalized the violence of the prison within our social lives. Consequently, this subtle violence becomes invisible, often even to its victims, especially because it colonizes everyday life, such as language, ways of thinking, and even lifestyle. Cunene and Tori note that the process of reasserting Indigenous collective rights will require major institutional change to criminal justice agencies, particularly as the criminal justice system has been the site of where, I'm quoting them now, Indigenous rights have been ignored, in particular rights to self-determination, self-government, and authority over the maintenance of social order. The willingness for major cultural justice changes have been mixed across the settler states. While there have been examples of shifts that could be seen as being responsive to Indigenous peoples, such as sentencing circle and marae-based youth courts, the rangatahi courts, the Pasifika courts, these still align firmly with state structures that accommodate Indigenous aspirations rather than truly face up to what a history of dispossession and institutional racism has produced. The assertion of Indigenous sovereignty that has never been ceded threatens to reveal what Audra Simpson has described as the settlement secret, the secret of Indigenous sovereignty. Shireen Razak notes that settlers must always forget the source of their state's existence, the dispossession of sovereign nations and the obliterations of human beings it requires. Forgetting requires the disappearance of the native, since the settler never leaves. Moana Jackson claims that even the term settler is a problem as it misrepresents the reality of dispossession. Prisons are sites of both forgetting and they are sites of the legitimation of the rights of the settler state. Jackson states that colonization is, I'm quoting him, in fact, the history that has never left us. It has always been about Indigenous people being a threat whenever they have questioned their dispossession or whenever the colonizers wanted to keep them in a position of political powerlessness and economic equality. The real or perceived threat has always been met through military, has always been met, I'm still quoting Moana here, it's always been met with violence, either through military or paramilitary action, or the more subtle, but no less violent use of personal, collective, and legal denigration. Often prison administrator and state ministry responses to Indigenous overrepresentation rely on a broader discussion to increase culturally responsive programs within the prison. This type of talk seems to suggest that prisons are just vehicles for delivering programs and completely renders invisible that the fact that prisons are not just about punishment, deterrence, rehabilitation, and capacitation. They hold a much more significant moral and symbolic roles. They reflect the state of the world in which we live. Prisons are architectures of control and one of the clearest expressions of state power. Moreover, prisons diminish all of those who reside or work within them. As I've repeated in many spaces, the pervasiveness of prisons creates cognitive restriction because we cannot see beyond it. Even people who want to see beyond their prison, struggle to see beyond the prison. So we need to explore alternatives and discuss what this really means. Certainly, these are just a few things, certainly not all. There's people doing much better, much bigger work in this space than I. But certainly it does mean that there needs to be a focus on our tamariki from the youngest of ages and indeed pre-birth. There needs to be structural changes that look at the redistribution of wealth and benefits in society to ensure greater collective well-being and security. Initially, this type of commitment to change is societally challenging. You do need a significant movement that explores what decarceration means and creates shared education forums, wānanga, hui. The courage comes from being prepared to have difficult conversations and to challenge each other, to model alternatives and model the impacts. We also need to recognize that there will be failure, and the creative enterprise, the cultural enterprise, the moral enterprise, the emancipatory enterprise is one where you often have to fail. My sense is we should be prepared to fail fast and to document that failure honestly and with considerable detail. We cannot bury our failures, or worse, systemize them. Our current system is one of system failure and societal and moral inertia. So we need to create the conditions for change. Understanding failure then is really important. Is it a failure because those with lived experience have not shaped the solution? Is it a failure because it was in a specific place and time? Is it a resource failure? Is it a failure of imagination? Is it a failure because the solutions are not culturally informed, gender informed, or trauma informed? Or is it actually that it doesn't work? Decarceration strategies demand an appetite for risk, but they also demand a high level of social accountability. We need to think about what social collective safety, collective security looks like. So not just individual safety, but broader forms of safety. We need an alternative that do not mimic the current carceral imperative. I think for Māori, the hapu is our biggest space for movement. We have real expertise within hapu. We have deep, extended whānau connections. We can draw on whakapapa, particularly the generative processes of whakapapa and forms of restoration within the hapu context. I think iwi have an important role to play, but I actually think there's a lot more work that can be done at the hapu level because of the much more intimate connections that demand whole of whānau approaches. In non-Māori spaces, we may look to either family connections, relationship connections, societal connections that may sit within and outside of kinship groups. We really need to focus on what reinvestment or even just investment into community solutions in terms of social communal spaces that allow forms of constructive and sustainable justice. Social infrastructure is so critical. We often talk about infrastructure, you know, when in times of on times of austerity, we often see that sort of social dimensions are just taken out. And so we sort of think that infrastructure is roads, but social infrastructure is, you know, those places, whether they be schools, community, marae, libraries, social infrastructure is so critical, both in terms of the work of abolition, but actually in the ability for us to flourish as a society. Certainly in regards to this types of approaches that I'm looking at here, they are highly relational and they are resource heavy. Our present system is non-relational and is extremely resource heavy. The status quo is unbelievably expensive, socially, culturally, financially. And as many have heard me say, it is a fully funded failure. So what does prison take? Family, freedom, and the future. These words from a woman who had spent much of her adult life churning through the prison system and far too much of her childhood within the state care system speak to her personal legacies of devastation. What did it take? She said it took family, freedom, and the future. It speaks to, as I said, her personal legacy of devastation. While prison, corrective, and rehabilitative objectives are hard to evidence, its damaging impacts at individual and societal levels are easier to document. Another young woman who had suffered high levels of social harm and violence as a child, followed then by imprisonment as a teenager, wrote in a poem, "The one thing that you will never see is to be captured, having never been free." While prisons confine people and institute forced association between individuals who often share similar histories and social characteristics, they do not eradicate the conditions conducive to the production and reproduction of social harms. Indeed, they reproduce them. So they are not places of eradication of harm. They are places of the reproduction of harm. To seek an end of imprisonment as the primary means of addressing social, economic, and political problems means a need to drastically reduce reliance on incarceration and to build the social institutions and conceptual frameworks that would render incarceration unnecessary. Decarceration is not a simple call for the immediate tearing down of all prison walls, but entails an array of alternative, non-penal regulatory frameworks and a commitment to mauri ora, to human flourishing. For this to happen, it must first be an act of an imagination, informed by research, informed by the experience and expertise of those who have been harmed and those who have harmed. And it is a recognition that too often these are not discrete or separate groups. It must be fueled by a desire for greater levels of safety and a reduction of social harm. Most critically, It must be focused on ensuring better lives for all of our mokopuna and their mokopuna. Kia ora tātou.
Ngā mihi nui e ngā rangatira mō tō whakaaro, mō tō kōrero, mō tō hungatanga. I feel like whatever I'm going to say is not going to be enough to just illustrate. I can see all the hearts and the clapping that's coming through on the emojis here, but I just feel like whatever I'm going to say is just not going to illustrate just the powerful and transformational kōrero you have shared with us. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I feel goosebumps. I feel like we just need to pause here and just reflect on the words of wisdom that has been shared with us by this wahine tour, and then think about what do we do now in all our respective spaces that we work in. This is a time now for questions and answers, and I'm just going to go through. Look, Tracy, I don't know if you've had the opportunity, but the feedback that has been coming through, powerful kōrero, beautiful kōrero, impactful kōrero. And there are some key points that I've really valued from your kōrero is the way in which you've expressed your mahi, you've balanced the realities and the challenges of the work that you do, and yet you still continue to give us a sense of real hope. And I'm going to quote you on this: to create the world we want to inhabit is just so powerful. Words you've shared in terms of being prepared to fail, you know, first, and document our failures, and then we continue to move forward. And the one thing that I really wanted to highlight is just the way in which you've shared this kōrero, and I'm looking for questions. And I wanted to ask you right now, what you've said, it makes absolute sense. It makes absolute sense. And as you said before, there are others before you that have spoken to this kōrero, and there will continue to be others after you that will continue in this mahi. But what gets in the way? You've spoken about it, you know, but can you just say a little bit more? Because
I think, kia ora, Julia, look, what gets in the way? Sometimes we get in our own way. So I think when I say that, not in terms of the belief that you can't create the conditions for change, the belief that it can't change, the sense of hopelessness is something that often, you know, it just seems too big. And the thing that I always say, and, you know, and I know some people have heard me say this many times before, you know, things stay the way they do until they change. There are so many things that have happened globally, within world history, within the history of Aotearoa, that we couldn't imagine they could change until they changed. So, you know, slavery, it was impossible for the abolition of slavery until it happens. The apartheid state, it's impossible for that to change and those power dynamics to change until it happens. Something at a you know, marriage equality within Aotearoa, New Zealand, impossible to imagine that could change until it changes. So I think that's the other element, that things may change very quick within our lifetime or very slowly. I think the much broader one, which you're probably talking about, is that it's just the impossibility to think beyond the prison. We think of prisons as being, you know, even though they're totally invisible, even though we can drive past them and hardly notice them, that they're all over our landscape and yet we hardly note them. But they have such strong symbolic social power. And so the ability to think of the what beyond in many ways is incapacitated by that. The other element is a very strong, within our own history of Aotearoa New Zealand, we have a very strong punitive response. We have a very strong sanction response. And so rather than a real focus on how do you truly, I mean, I think it's very difficult for even people who are strong supporters of prisons for them to say hand on heart that when someone comes out of prison, that we have greater levels of collective security or safety. So even those that believe in prison also don't expect good outcomes from them. I would say that if you actually believed in prisons, you would have to believe that they actually produce excellent outcomes. There's no evidence of that. And actually, my sense of those who are really strong proponents of increasing prisons, the focus so much is on a punishment-centered way of thinking about things that they don't even expect good outcomes. financially, socially, culturally.
Mm.
So there's a lot on the way, but there's also that spaces of hope, because actually we can create the conditions for change.
Absolutely, and that was clear in your kōrero. I do have some questions here, Tracy. The first question is, how can those of us engaged in this mahi keep the hope alive and not succumb to despair?
It's such an important question. In many ways, I think it's one of the most important questions. And it's why I do often talk about, the need for joyful activity, the reckon around imagination, our importance around the collective. In my own life, in my own practice, I go between hope and hopelessness. And Julia, I know that you do too.
Mm.
I know that we've talked about that. I know that we've talked about that when we've been inside prisons and you come out, the state of being between hope and hopelessness. And so a lot of it, I think, is a need for really, the sort of radical honesty about what is the bit that, what is the bit of the day that has made this feel like hopeless work? The collective is important. Sometimes it means really modest tasks.
Mm.
And I think that I really celebrate the very small and the very modest. I'm like everyone. I want to see exponential change. I want to see this massive creative change, but I see the mahi and work that goes on everywhere, at the flax roots, at the grassroots, at the whānau level, and it's hard work. But, it can create changes in everyone's lives, just even changing around the language. So we have to work like quite purposefully in places of joy. It does mean sometimes you need to be able to rest. You need to be able to set it aside. You need to think, I just have to do a bit of reshaping on my priorities. But it needs to be purposeful, that it's not just the struggle, that it is also with the goal of these broader freedoms that a far greater level of people could share.
Absolutely. I have another pātai for you. Tēnā koe, Tracy. I imagine that your kōrero is world leading. I recently learned that there are no women in prison in Hawaii. What are other places doing differently, and are there decarceration initiatives that inspire you?
Actually, the incarceration rates of in Hawaii are quite high, and that the issue around wahine Hawaiian has been an issue for activists, policy, all sorts of people within Hawaii. So in looking at, I think that, working with Hawaiian colleagues, this has been an area of considerable pain around those areas, and they've been very active, particularly thinking about, sometimes you take it on the task around women is looking at women with very young children, just trying to put particular types of parameters up. As I said, at the moment, I don't think that particular ideal has been yet fully realized in Hawaii or in any other place. So are there places that are doing things well? I think there is incredible practices amongst both abolition and broader social groups that I think make a difference in people's lives. I think there has been work that's been done that, particularly at how you reintegrate, or often, as Moana would talk about, just integrate, that people have not ever been fully integrated. So at those levels, which is sort of a part of an excarceration element. So it's a strategy of decarceration in that it tries to prevent people ever being in the prison. It's hard for me to really point. I know that we always point to Scandinavia, and there's certainly things I think that we can learn from there, but there may be there's still certain things about the use of coercive control, whether it be in Scandinavia, whether it be in the US, or whether it be here, that needs to be addressed. But are there good things done? I mean, you go to something like Sisters Inside conference over in Brisbane every 2 years, and you just see the incredible work that's been done in Aboriginal communities, within prisons, outside of prisons, and you do feel refreshed and renewed.
Kia ora. Now I've got another one. What, if any, role do you see iwi playing in decarceration? And this is not to absolve government of responsibility, but curious about how you see iwi rather than non-tribal organisations in this regard.
I mean, I think iwi have that important role, as I noted. I think particularly at the role of hapu, I think that's a really significant one. And we know that there are iwi at the moment very involved. So we see initiatives in Ngāti Porou, Ngāti Kahungunu and Tainui, so Ngāi Tahu, you know, so you do definitely see those that have initiatives in that area that look about the way that they will sort of wrap a koroai around their own people. So I think there's definitely a role. I think it's an important role. Again, it's in that habilitation space. It's around the broader forms of collective accountability. You know, I agree that it doesn't take away the Crown responsibility. You can't sort of have something where the state, where Crown causes great harm and then Māori have to be the solution. So we often have these social problems, and there's an expectation that there's always going to be a Māori solution. In saying that, I do believe that the expertise and experience lies within iwi and in hapu. I guess what I'm really cautious of is the replication or the mimicking of our present system. You know, for me, the notion of a Māori prison is an absolute anathema to me, but I also recognise the rights of iwi and others to think about how they will respond to these issues.
Kia ora. Now, just to let you all know, we've got a couple more minutes before I wrap things up for today. So I'm just going to keep an eye on our question and answers. I have a question for you, Tracy. I'm making the assumption that there will be students here that will be listening to your kōrero, and I'm just wondering what would be your message to them who are at the beginning of their journey into this work?
Well, it's for me, it's the most wonderful thing, because, you know, and I say it all the time, my students will have heard it. I mean, I believe that, you know, the tauira that we have now and our new graduates and our new scholars, all of those are going to take us to place that I could not even imagine. And, you know, Moana and I did talk about this, and that was really one of the things that gave him great joy, was recognizing these generations to come. They think differently, they react differently, they have different types of platforms that they are able to use and avail themselves of. So when you're starting at the beginning, you know, there's something quite overwhelming about this space, and it often creates both intellectual, emotional and cultural fatigue, but just start, you know, this thing that I say, why are we where we are? Think about that in terms of yourself, think about the connections that you can make, and, you know, just go into this thing in a way that's open, honest, but also recognize that within you, and both as individuals, but particularly collectively, there is that real possibility of change, that it is these younger ones that are coming through that I would hope will be able to see, you know, the manifestation and the expression of far greater levels of freedom.
Kia ora. Got another one that has just come through, and I'm going to shorten this question, Jessica, so hopefully I'm doing it justice. So the question is around the upcoming, you know, the proposed changes in the youth justice space. And as Māori, we are raising our concerns. So the question is really for you, Tracy, in terms of, do you have any advice for advocacy in this space?
I think it's such a critical space. You know, like, we know that the earlier you are touched by the criminal justice system and the earlier you are touched by any form of constraint, detention, incarceration, the far longer life course ramifications will be had. So the locking up of children should be one of our most primary critical concerns. All of our children, all of our tamariki, have the right to be safe, to be loved, to not have their opportunities blunted, that everything that we should do for children should be able to open up their life course trajectory, not close it down. So in terms of advocacy, I think this is really important, both collectively and also bringing in people that you normally wouldn't bring into the party. I think that when the Royal Commission's Abuse and Care report comes out, I think that it is important for all of us to really make sure that that kōrero goes wide. You know, this will be a document that really documents the national shame of how our children, our tamariki, have been treated and continue to be treated. So my thing is that it's important that we have the allies alongside of us, but also to go broader than our normal allies. You know, that we can't just have a conversation amongst ourselves. We need to broaden that conversation. And so we also means that these elements around what those alternatives look like, but truly the issue around our children is one of the for me, one of the most concerning things that we have to face at the moment. We're seeing it in Australia as well, significant investment in what really could be just called children's jails.
Kia ora, Tracy. Ngā mihi nui. This is the end of our pātai for this afternoon. I do want to hand it back to you, Tracy, for any final concluding comments before I wrap things up from my end. Over to you.
Oh, yeah, kia ora. Look, it's been, a real privilege. I want to thank everyone. I think that the organisers of this incredible conference is just astonishing. Over 10 days, the richness that we've been able to avail ourselves on right till this last day. So I just do want to really mihi to the organisers. And I guess my last word is that, it's sort of what I've just constantly repeated throughout this thing. This is important work. This is critical work, but truly it also can be life-affirming work. It affirms the humanity in each other. So I always say about this work, what is the nature of it? It's just human work. It's our ability to be human together. It means that sometimes, as I see, it reveals things that can be terrible to reveal, and often really challenge our comprehension about how we've arrived at the state that we're at. But it is work that is important, and that generational element is such an important feature. What a wonderful thing to think that our children will flourish and our grandchildren will flourish, such as I said, the intent of Mokopunatanga. Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora, Tracy. I just saw on one of the messages, just in terms of just thanking you, e ngā mihi nui. I'm going to say it again. Ngā mihi nui e ngā rangatira, Tracy, mō tō whakaro, mō tō kōrero, mō tō hungatanga. Whaftai tēle lava mō lo whaasoa, whaftai tēle lava mō lo ngā lue whaamaoni mō tātou tamariki, ma whānau i ngei I Aotearoa. Tēnā koe. Before I close us off for today, can I just thank all of our volunteers and our partners who have continued to bring this event to life, and just acknowledging all the organisations. You can see that on our slide today. And I just want to make some key announcement and reminders to us all, making sure that we join the Kei Te Mura o Te Whahi, the Marathon for Racial Justice, and also which is on Friday, the 22nd of March, starting at 8:30 in the morning. And then just making sure, just a reminder that all the recordings will be uploaded to YouTube. So please share this widely. So just from myself and on behalf of the team here today, as well as acknowledging our rangatira, our wahine tour, Professor Tracy McIntosh, nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Māori ora.